Just when much of the world thought the global economy had settled into a predictable cycle of slow growth and cautious optimism, a new warning emerged that shook markets and policymakers alike. The head of Canada's central bank, Governor Tiff Macklem, has sounded the alarm. The Canadian economy now faces an unusual and unprecedented risk of a new economic shock, driven not by market forces or natural disasters, but by geopolitical tensions and the unpredictable trade policies of the United States under President Donald Trump. In a world still recovering from pandemic aftershocks and simmering geopolitical rivalries, this warning signals something more profound: a seismic shift in how global economic stability is understood and threatened. Canada and the United States have long been economic partners, the closest in the world, with deep integration across industries, supply chains, and labor markets. For decades, Canadian exports flowed southward with minimal friction, while American goods and capital poured into Canada in return. But that seamless partnership has deteriorated amid a series of tariff threats, trade disputes, and policy unpredictability emanating from Washington. President Trump's administration has deployed tariffs as a blunt instrument, targeting Canadian steel, aluminum, lumber, and other industries in a rapidly escalating trade conflict that has stoked uncertainty nationwide. It is this environment of unpredictability, more than any single policy, that Macklem says could trigger a shock unlike anything Canada has faced in recent decades. Governor Macklem's warning did not come in a vacuum. Speaking in a rare and candid interview with international media, Macklem pointed to heightened geopolitical risks and U.S. trade policy unpredictability as central threats that could abruptly derail Canada's economic projections. His concern was not merely about tariff numbers or trade statistics, it was about the fragile confidence that underpins investment, hiring, consumer spending, and long-term economic planning. When businesses cannot predict the future, they stop investing. When consumers feel uncertain, they cut back. That dynamic can morph into a shock that ripples through an entire economy, even one as resilient as Canada's. Macklem's caution comes at a time when the Bank of Canada had recently held interest rates steady, signaling modest growth expectations for 2026 and 2027. But he made it clear that these forecasts are fragile and subject to rapid reversal if external shocks materialize. Among the most troubling indicators he cited was Trump's repeated threats of imposing extreme tariffs on Canadian goods, potentially even punitive 100% duties if Canada pursues certain trade relationships. Against this backdrop, Macklem said that the traditional view of Canada's economic trajectory, steady, resilient, and closely tied to U.S. demand, can no longer be taken for granted. What makes Macklem's warning particularly striking is his emphasis on unpredictability as a risk multiplier. Economists have long understood that uncertainty, even more than specific policy actions, can undermine business confidence and consumer behavior. When companies are unsure whether tariffs will rise next month or whether supply chains will be disrupted overnight, they respond not by planning for growth, but by preparing for potential downturns. That can look like delaying investments, freezing hiring, or hoarding cash, behaviors that collectively slow economic activity. It's a phenomenon Macklem and other central bankers now see playing out in real time. The Bank of Canada's concerns align with broader evidence of strain in the Canadian economy. Recent data shows that exports have been hit hard by rising U.S. tariffs, contributing to a contraction in some sectors and cooling growth overall. In the second quarter of 2025, exports reportedly fell by nearly 27%, with real GDP contracting and unemployment climbing. These are not minor blips. They signal structural shifts in trade flows that could have lasting effects if tariff policies remain in place or escalate further. In practical terms, a shock could take various forms, but its consequences would likely be broad and deep. Canada's economy is heavily dependent on exports. Roughly 1/3 of GDP is tied to goods and services sold abroad. A sudden drop in demand from the United States or prolonged tariff barriers could reverberate through manufacturing, natural resources, and technology sectors. Jobs could be lost, investment plans shelved, and government revenues weakened. Macklem's warning suggested that this would not be a short-lived downturn followed by a quick rebound, as seen after the pandemic. Instead, he cautioned that if tariffs become long-lasting and broad-based, there won't be a bounce back. Another dimension of Macklem's concerns involves the role of the U.S. Federal Reserve. Trump's public criticisms and alleged threats to undermine the Fed's independence introduce another layer of economic uncertainty that extends beyond Canada's borders. The stability and predictability of U.S. monetary policy are important not just for the American economy, but for global financial conditions. If central banks cannot confidently set policy without political interference, market volatility could increase and global growth could slow, compounding Canada's economic challenges. Macklem raised this point explicitly, highlighting that threats to the Fed's autonomy could amplify risks for Canada's economy because of the close financial linkages between the two countries. Even beyond trade policy, Trump's broader geopolitical actions were cited by Macklem as factors contributing to economic headwinds. Policy moves related to Greenland, Venezuela, and other international stances inject a level of geopolitical risk that was previously uncommon for Canadian economic forecasts. While global markets have weathered shocks from wars, pandemics, and financial crises in the past, the mix of unpredictable U.S. economic policy and geopolitical posturing increases the number of variables that could disrupt global trade and investment, making the Canadian economy more vulnerable than it might otherwise be. This evolving risk landscape has prompted the Bank of Canada to emphasize caution and flexibility in its own policy choices. While the BOC has kept its trend-setting interest rate at current levels, Macklem has signaled that the central bank is ready to adjust its stance if economic conditions deteriorate. Monetary policy cannot by itself heal the wounds of a trade war or erase tariff barriers, but by keeping inflation anchored and maintaining confidence in price stability, the bank can provide a cushion against broader shocks. Still, Macklem has been clear that monetary tools have limitations in the face of geopolitical and trade-driven disruptions. Market reactions to Macklem's warning were immediate. Investors responded to the heightened risk narrative by adjusting expectations for Canadian financial assets, and analysts noted increased volatility in key sectors. Corporate decision-makers, already wary of U.S. tariff impacts, began factoring in longer-term risk scenarios involving structural changes to trade patterns. When companies rethink supply chains or shift focus to alternative markets to avoid tariff risk, the cumulative effect can slow growth even further. Despite the gloom of these warnings, there are areas of resilience in the Canadian economy. Domestic demand, driven by consumer spending and services, remains comparatively stable, and certain sectors such as technology and natural resources continue to find opportunities outside the U.S. market. Canada also has trade agreements with numerous economies beyond the United States, covering more than 50 countries. Macklem and other economic leaders have urged Canadian businesses to leverage these broader networks to reduce dependence on any one market. Still, shifting export focus is easier said than done. The United States has long been Canada's largest trading partner, absorbing roughly 3/4 of Canadian exports. Reconfiguring entrenched trade relationships takes time, investment, and political will. For small and medium-sized enterprises in particular, redirecting goods and services to new markets involves navigating unfamiliar regulatory landscapes, building new customer bases, and absorbing initial costs without guaranteed returns. Overcoming these hurdles is essential if Canada is to insulate itself from future economic shocks prompted by U.S. policy volatility. Another concern that emerges from this situation is the impact on Canadian households. Economic uncertainty tends to weigh on consumer confidence, which can dampen spending on big-ticket items like homes and cars. If exports and investment slow, job security becomes uncertain, and wage growth may stagnate. This can create a feedback loop that suppresses overall economic momentum. Macklem has repeatedly emphasized that while inflation control remains a priority, safeguarding economic confidence is equally crucial. The bank's approach seeks to maintain a balance between these sometimes competing goals. The broader context also includes political dynamics. Ottawa and Washington are currently engaged in ongoing trade negotiations tied to the USMCA agreement, and tensions over Trump's tariff threats have added stress to those discussions. Canadian leaders have pushed back against what they see as coercive tactics, arguing that predictable, rules-based trade should be the norm. This diplomatic pushback is part of a larger effort to diversify Canada's economic relationships and strengthen ties with other global trading partners. Critics of Macklem's warnings argue that central bankers should avoid political language and that markets tend to overreact to cautionary signals. They suggest that Canada's economic fundamentals remain strong enough to absorb shocks and that diversification strategies will pay off in the medium term. But even supporters of the bank's cautious stance acknowledge that uncertainty itself has become one of the most potent risks facing the global economy today. When policymakers in the world's largest economy send mixed signals, it becomes harder for smaller, integrated economies like Canada to plan for the future. What emerges from all of this is a sobering reality. Canada's economic resilience is being tested not by a single event, but by a confluence of policy shifts, geopolitical tensions, and market anxieties. Macklem's warning is not an idle prediction. It is a call to action, underscoring the need for strategic economic adaptation in the face of unknown and emerging threats. Whether through diversification of export markets, strengthening domestic demand, or enhancing adaptive monetary policy, Canada's economic leaders are grappling with an environment that few envisioned just a few years ago. As the global economic landscape continues to shift, Macklem's message remains clear. Stability cannot be taken for granted. In a world where trade policy can change abruptly, where geopolitical events can reverberate across continents, and where central banks must balance competing priorities, preparation and flexibility are paramount. For Canada, the path forward will require not just vigilance, but innovative thinking and international cooperation. Because in today's interconnected economy, no nation is immune from shocks that originate beyond its borders. What do you think? Can Canada withstand these risks? Or is this warning the first sign of a deeper economic storm? Comment below, like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications to stay up to date with the latest in global economic developments and how they affect your life and your country.